really think they'll believe I stayed late for the meeting?
When you say it like that, yes, you're very convincing.
Old habit. Quiet, steady inhale. We're fine. She's nowhere near here.
Room 412, the clerk said. But ma'am, there's already a guest on the reservation. A Ms. Darlene Watson. The lobby of the Harborview Grand moved around her. Fountain somewhere behind her. Chandeliers overhead throwing fractured light across marble floors. The young man at the desk had the careful face of someone who had just realized he was standing at the edge of someone else's catastrophe and was trying very hard not to show it. "That's my sister," Margaret said. "We're surprising him together." The lie came out clean. Steady. Her voice didn't waver, her hands didn't move, and the only thing that shifted was somewhere deep in her stomach. A long, slow drop, the kind that has no bottom. She had known, somewhere in the back of her body, since Paula's call the night before. But knowing and being told by a stranger that your baby sister is registered in your husband's hotel room, those are two different kinds of knowing. One lives in the body. The other lives in the world, permanent and witnessed, impossible to unfeel. Margaret took the key card, smiled, thanked him, walked to the elevator. She was 35 years old. 3 months of chemotherapy ran through her veins. A doctor had told her 18 to 24 months, maybe longer, maybe less. And she had taken that sentence home and built her remaining life around the man waiting at the door when she got there. She was carrying the Tory birch bag Richard had given her for their 10th anniversary. Cream leather, gold hardware. The kind of gift that says I see you when the person giving it actually means it. She pressed forward at the door's closed point. 10 years. She turned the number over on the way up. 10 years of too strong coffee she'd learned to love because she loved him. 10 years of school drop-offs and renovated kitchens and holiday dinners, and the specific way he said her name when he was worried. Maggie. Like she was something breakable and precious, but she'd told him in the oncologist's parking lot. Stage 3 pancreatic. He'd taken her face in both hands and looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. She had believed that look. She had built 8 months on top of it. The elevator opened on 4. Hallway 400 stretched ahead, silent. Cream carpet. Ice machine humming somewhere. Room numbers climbing. 408, 410, for 12. Margaret stopped outside the door, raised her hand to knock. Then she heard Darlene. Not words first. Just the texture of her voice, the pitch of it. Coming through the door in a register Margaret had never heard from her sister before. Breathless, intimate. The kind of sound that belongs behind closed doors between people who have no business being behind that door together. Then the words themselves. Yes, Richard. God, yes. I love you. Margaret's knees softened. Her hand found the wall. The anniversary bag, cream leather, gold hardware, 10 years of believing, slid from her shoulder and landed on the carpet without a sound. She stood there. 1 second. 2. The sounds continued through the door. Richard's voice. Lower, harder to make out. The rhythmic creak of furniture. Her sister's breathing, unmistakable, intimate, wrong. She did not knock. She did not scream. She did not collapse, though her legs wanted to, though every cell in her body understood what was happening in a language older and more certain than thought. Instead, and she would not fully understand this impulse until later, until she had rebuilt enough of herself to recognize what her body knew before her mind caught up. She reached into the anniversary bag and pulled out her phone. She pressed. Record point 2:47 p.m. Wednesday, October 9th. The room number was visible above the door in the frame. The sounds coming through the door were clear enough that no explanation would ever be required. She photographed the hallway, the door, the do not disturb sign that had probably been hanging there since Monday. Then she walked back to the elevator, pressed the button, and stood with her hands at her sides, absolutely still. The way she went still in the library when something needed deciding. The way stillness, for her, had always been the first step toward action. The elevator opened. She stepped in. She did not cry until the doors closed. Room 618. Cash. Her maiden name. Holt. Not Morrison. Not the name she had worn like a second skin for 10 years. She stood at the window. Savannah below. Warm. Spanish moss. October golden. completely indifferent to her. She gave herself 7 minutes. Hands pressed to her mouth. The sound she made was private, and she would describe it to no one, ever. Then she washed her face, sat on the edge of the bed, picked up her phone. Veronica Steele answered on the second ring. Document everything, Veronica said when Margaret finished talking. Flat, professional, steady in exactly the way Margaret needed, because her own steadiness had just been spent on 7 minutes with her hands over her mouth. Don't file yet. Don't confront them. Don't let them know you know. Can you do that? Margaret looked at the window, the golden light dying over the squares below. Spanish moss barely moving. The warm world on the other side of sealed glass. She touched the back of her left hand without noticing. Yes, she said. Good. Veronica's voice was the voice of someone who had seen this before and knew exactly what came next. Then we go to war. You're still here. That means something. Not everyone sits with this kind of pain. Most people look away. If you're the kind of person who stays for the truth, even when it's ugly, subscribe. Because what comes next is going to change the way you understand love, loyalty, and what a woman is capable of when she finally decides she's done being underestimated. That night, 6 floors above her husband and her sister, Margaret lay on the hotel bedspread fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. She was 35 years old. She had married Richard at 25, when she was still young enough to believe that love was the same thing as safety. She had 2 children, Daniel, 16, and Christine, 14, who were home right now with a neighbor they trusted, because their father was at a conference and their mother had taken a last-minute flight to check on something she couldn't name over the phone. Being good had protected her from nothing, that IT had not kept him faithful, had not kept Darlene loyal, had not saved the 10 years she'd poured into a man who had looked at her in a parking lot like she was everything. While somewhere in his phone was another woman's number, another future, another plan that required her death to execute. Being good had simply made her easier to fool. She didn't sleep. She opened her laptop and began. Her phone screen glowed in the dark of room 618. Downstairs, Richard was sleeping. He had no idea she was in the building. That, she understood, was the first advantage. She intended to keep it. Room 618 smelled like recycled air and sealed windows. The thermostat was locked at 68 degrees, the kind of cold that hotels impose without asking, impersonal and absolute. Outside, Savannah was doing what Savannah does in October, warm and unhurried, the air thick with humidity and the smell of river water and old stone. Spanish moss hung from the oaks in the square below, moving in a slow, honey-thick breeze. A woman walked her dog along the cobblestones, unhurried. A man sat on a bench reading something. The world outside that window was soft and amber and completely indifferent to what was happening in room 618. Inside, 68 degrees. Recycled air. The faint chemical smell of hotel carpet cleaner. Margaret Holt, 35 years old, in the same clothes she'd traveled in, sitting at the small desk with her laptop open and her phone beside it, and a bowl of room service soup going cold at her elbow. She had stopped crying 20 minutes ago. She was not going to start again. The first thing she did was change her passwords, all of them. Email, personal bank account, the one in her maiden name she'd maintained since she was 22, the one her mother had insisted on. Always keep something that's only yours, baby, just in case. She'd called it her rainy day fund, and Richard had always smiled at it, faintly, the way you smile at something quaint. She was not smiling now. She changed the passwords to something from before him, something he would never reach. Then she opened their shared financial dashboard, the one Richard had set up 2 years ago. It's just easier to see everything in one place, Maggie, and began reading with the specific attention she brought to documents that mattered. The way she read grant applications, legal contracts, things with consequences, joint checking, $14, 200. Joint savings, $47,800. She paused. 6 months ago, it had been closer to $80,000. She wrote the difference in the margin of the notepad beside her laptop. Didn't name it yet. Just wrote the number. Richard's 401k. She had viewing access, had been listed as beneficiary for years. $340,000. As she clicked on the beneficiary field, The name was not hers. She stared at the screen. Then she took a screenshot. Then she opened a new folder, dated it, encrypted it with a password she would not write down anywhere, and saved the screenshot inside. She kept going. His company pension, $180,000 vested. She clicked the beneficiary, not her name, screenshot. Filed. She picked up her phone and found the number for their life insurance provider. Too late to call. It was past 9 p.m. She wrote the number down. She would call tomorrow morning, from this room, before she did anything else. She already knew what she would find. She needed it documented. She opened a new document and began listing assets. The joint savings, whatever remained. The retirement accounts. The pension. The Myers Park house, currently assessed at $890,000. The Outer Banks cottage, her mother's, protected by the prenup. The $2 million life insurance policy she'd taken out on herself 3 years ago at Richard's suggestion. It's just smart planning, Maggie. Think about what it would mean for the kids, with Richard as primary beneficiary. She added the numbers. The total sat at the bottom of the column like a sentence she'd been meant to never read. $3.4 million. Approximately. She looked at it. That was the number they had looked at and decided she was worth more dead than present. That her 10 years of loving them without question. The too strong coffee, the chemo appointments, the school runs, the specific vulnerability of telling your husband you were dying at 35 and believing him when he said he would stay. All of it was worth less than $3.4 million distributed cleanly upon her quiet, assisted exit. She saved the document, moved it to the encrypted folder. Then she transferred $23,000 from the joint savings into her personal account. Her contributions, traceable, documented, legally hers. Not all of it. Enough. The kind of amount that looks like household management rather than flight. She was a librarian. She understood how to organize information so it could not be lost or denied. She was discovering, surprisingly good at war. Whitmore answered at 8:45 p.m. like someone who expected calls at 8:45 p.m. Veronica had described him in 3 words. Ex-FBI, Atlanta, thorough. Margaret gave him the facts the same way she'd given them to Veronica, succinctly, without editorializing. The way you brief someone whose job is to find what you can't find yourself. He asked 4 questions. She answered them. Savannah by noon tomorrow, he said. I'll be here. Room 618, Harborview Grand. Maiden name, Holt. When she hung up, she sat for a moment watching the warm Savannah night through the sealed window. The woman with the dog was gone. The man on the bench was gone. The square was empty now, the Spanish moss still, the amber streetlights holding the cobblestones in a light that had nothing to do with her situation and yet felt, somehow, like a reminder that the world was still out there. Still running. Still indifferent and beautiful. She would be out there again. She was going to make sure of it. Whitmore sent his first report the following evening. Margaret read it at the desk in room 618, the cold air pressing down, the warm Savannah dusk outside the window, a glass of water untouched beside her laptop. The affair had started 14 months ago. She sat with that for a long moment. She had been telling herself, somewhere below conscious thought, in the place where we store the things we cannot yet face, that this had begun because she was sick. That fear and grief had pushed 2 people toward each other while she was deteriorating. That it was terrible, but it was also, in some broken way, human. 14 months ago she had not been sick. 14 months ago, she had been 33 years old, healthy and present and married and trusting, and Richard had been driving to meet her sister at hotels in cities far enough away not to matter. And Darlene had been lying to her face at every family dinner, every phone call, every I love you. Sis delivered without a tremor. The cancer had not created this. It had simply made it convenient. She turned to the next page. The texts were dated 3 weeks after her diagnosis. Whitmore had pulled them from the backup of Richard's secondary phone, a prepaid device registered to a name that didn't exist, purchased 8 months ago in cash. The messages had been deleted. Whitmore had found them anyway. Richard, the doctor says 18 to 24 months. We just have to wait. Once she's gone, we'll have everything. The house, the retirement accounts, the beach property, Her $2 million life insurance policy. All of it. Margaret read the sentence twice. Her eyes moved to the number, $2 million, and she felt something she recognized from the financial dashboard the night before. The particular cold of being reduced to a figure, of understanding that the people who said I love you had also, in the same breath, calculated your value and found it higher dead than alive. She kept reading. Darlene, I feel bad sometimes. But she was always Mom's favorite. She got the beach house and the will while I got nothing. This is just the universe balancing things out. Richard, don't feel bad. We deserve to be happy. And honestly, the chemo is making her miserable anyway. We're doing her a favor by letting her think she's loved while she goes. The room was very quiet. Outside, the warm savanna evening moved through the Spanish moss without urgency. A couple appeared in the square below, the woman leaning into the man, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something Margaret couldn't hear through the sealed glass. Inside room 618, it was 68 degrees, and Margaret Holt was 35 years old, reading a text message in which her husband described her dying as doing her a favor. She did not cry. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "Receipts." She underlined it once. Then she turned to the next page of Whitmore's report and kept reading. By midnight she had done 6 things. Changed every password. Moved $23,000. Documented every asset. Encrypted every file. Briefed Veronica. Read every text Whitmore had found. She had also done one more thing. She had looked at her own reflection in the bathroom mirror of room 618 for a long time. She had not recognized the woman looking back. She was beginning to think that was not a bad thing. She found the safety deposit box at 6:14 a.m. She hadn't slept. She'd spent the night at the desk in room 618, the cold pressing down, Savannah warming slowly outside the sealed window, working through Whitmore's preliminary report with the same systematic attention she brought to cataloging a new library acquisition. Cross-referencing, flagging inconsistencies, following threads. Whitmore had pulled Richard's credit card records going back 18 months. Most of it was predictable: gas, groceries, the Atlantic Building Supply corporate card for client dinners. But there was a recurring charge she didn't recognize. $85 annually. A bank she'd never heard of. A branch location in a small town 40 minutes outside Charlotte. She opened her laptop. Searched the bank. Found the branch. Found their hours. Safety deposit box rental. $85 per year. The standard fee. She wrote the branch address on her notepad, circled it twice, and moved to the next thread. The secondary phone was easier than it should have been. Richard had always been careless with technology in the specific way of men who believe no one is looking. He used the same password, their wedding anniversary, reversed, for everything she'd ever seen him lock. She had never mentioned this. She had simply noticed it, the way she noticed everything, and filed it away without knowing why. She knew why now. She opened the shared family cloud account, the one they'd set up 2 years ago for shared calendars and contact backups, and searched for devices. 3 devices listed. Her phone, Richard's primary phone, and a third device, unnamed, last backed up 6 days ago from a location in Charlotte. She clicked on the backup. The device had synced contacts, call logs, and, because Richard had not bothered to disable it, a partial message backup. She found Darlene's number listed under a man's name she didn't recognize. She found 14 months of call logs. She found enough. She forwarded everything to Whitmore with a single line: secondary device backup in family cloud. Pull everything. Whitmore responded in 4 minutes. On it. She closed the laptop and looked at the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten. The Spanish moss caught the first gray of morning and held it. The oaks enormous and still. The square below empty and quiet. Inside, Margaret had not slept and did not feel tired. She felt, for the first time since the elevator doors had closed on her yesterday afternoon, completely clear. Veronica called at 7:30 a.m. "I've been thinking about the life insurance policy," she said. No greeting. No preamble. The $2 million policy with Richard as primary beneficiary. "We need to move on that today. Can we change the beneficiary without him knowing? It's your policy. Taken out in your name. You have every legal right to change the beneficiary at any time without his knowledge or consent. A brief pause. I'd recommend changing it to Daniel and Christine directly. Removes him entirely. Margaret thought about her children. Daniel, 16, home right now with their neighbor Paula watching over them. Christine, 14, who had texted her last night. Mom, when are you coming home? Dad's not answering his phone. She had typed back, tomorrow, baby. All good. Love you. Do it, she said. Draft the change of beneficiary form. I'll sign it today. She moved through the lobby of the Harborview Grand at 9 a.m. wearing sunglasses and a scarf she'd bought from a gift shop on the ground floor. She sat in a chair beside a large potted palm in the far corner of the lobby, angled toward the elevator bank, and she waited. She was a librarian. She knew how to be still and unnoticed in a room, T923. The elevator opened and Richard stepped out. She had not seen him since Sunday morning. 3 days ago, his cedar aftershave filling the hallway of their house as he kissed her goodbye, his leather briefcase in one hand, rolling suitcase in the other, his phone already lighting up with messages as he walked to the car. She had stood at the door and watched him go and felt only love. Uncomplicated, unguarded. Love. She watched him cross the lobby now. He was wearing the gray suit she'd had dry cleaned for him last month. His hair was neat. His posture was the confident posture of a man who believed his secrets were safe. He walked to the hotel restaurant without looking around, without hesitation, without the particular wariness of a man who had any reason to check whether he was being watched. He believed she was home. Sick. Grateful. Waiting. He believed their 16-year-old son and 14-year-old daughter were being raised by a mother who had no idea what their father was doing. She watched him sit down at a table by the window, pick up a menu, check his phone, smile at something on the screen. She watched him for 4 minutes. She memorized the smile. Then she walked to the elevator. She had a beneficiary change form to sign. Darlene appeared at 10:15. Margaret had not planned to still be in the lobby. She was standing at the coffee counter, back to the lobby, when she heard the laugh. She knew that laugh. She had known it for 30 years. She stood at the coffee counter and listened to her sister's voice. Warm, easy, the voice of someone who had slept well and had no reason not to. As Darlene crossed the lobby and joined Richard at the restaurant table, the sound of Darlene's laugh in that lobby did something to Margaret that the texts had not quite done. The texts were evidence. Cold, digital, removable from the people who'd written them. This was Darlene's actual voice, in actual air, in a hotel where she was registered on Margaret's husband's room, while Margaret was 3 floors up with an encrypted folder, an assigned beneficiary change form, and a private investigator pulling records in Atlanta. Margaret picked up her coffee, added cream, stirred it. Her hands were steady. She walked to the elevator without looking toward the restaurant. Whitmore called at 2 p.m. I pulled the secondary device back up, he said. There's more. Significantly more. How bad? Margaret asked without a pause. The specific pause of someone deciding how to deliver something. I need you to be sitting down, Whitmore said. Margaret sat down. Tell me, she said. Whitmore was still on the line when she sat down. Tell me, she said that he told her. The secondary phone backup contained 847 messages spanning 14 months. Whitmore had spent the night processing them. He read her the relevant ones in the flat, careful voice of someone who has learned to deliver terrible information without editorial. The first message he read was dated 4 months ago. Darlene to Richard. I've been reading about supplement interactions. There are things that interfere with chemo absorption. Natural things. Nobody would ever know. Margaret sat very still. Richard to Darlene. Are you sure? That seems... Darlene, it's not doing anything. It's just slowing things down. Letting nature take its course faster. The doctors already said the treatment might not work. We're not doing anything. We're just not stopping it. Richard. Which ones? Darlene. I'll handle it. You don't need to know the specifics. Just don't say anything about the smoothies. The room was very quiet. Outside, Savannah was going about its warm October morning, unhurried and golden, completely indifferent. There's more, Whitmore said. Keep going, Margaret said. He read her 6 more exchanges. Darlene researching supplement combinations on her laptop. cross-referencing with Margaret's specific chemotherapy protocol, which she'd photographed from the treatment summary Margaret kept on the kitchen counter. Darlene ordering colloidal silver, grapefruit seed extract, St. John's wort, all in bulk, all through the shared Amazon Prime account she'd apparently forgotten was shared. Richard's responses growing shorter as the plan became concrete. Less questioning, more complicit. The last message Whitmore read was from 3 weeks ago. Richard to Darlene, "How is she doing?" Darlene, "Doctor said she's not responding the way they expected. They're adjusting the dosage. She doesn't suspect anything. She thanked me this morning for the smoothie." Richard, "Good. Keep going." Margaret heard those 2 words and felt something she had never felt before. Not grief, not rage. Something colder and more permanent than either. She had been thanking Darlene for the smoothies every morning. "Thank you. This is wonderful. You're so good to me." She had been thanking her sister for poisoning her. Margaret, Whitmore's voice, careful. "Are you still there?" "Yes," she said. "Keep going." The children piece came last. Whitmore had found a text thread between Richard and Daniel on the primary phone, recovered through the cloud backup. 8 messages over 4 weeks. Richard texting his own 16-year-old son that he read them without commentary. Richard to Daniel, "Hey buddy, your mom's been really confused lately. Doctors say it can happen with her type of cancer. Don't be alarmed if she says some weird stuff. Just let me know if she calls you sounding off, okay? Don't want her to scare you." Daniel's response, the text of a teenager who trusts his father. "Okay, Dad. Is she going to be okay?" Richard, "We're doing everything we can. She's just not herself right now. You're a good kid for asking." And then, a week later, to Christine. Richard to Christine, "Your Aunt Darlene has been such a rock through all of this. She basically lives with us now, helping out. I hope when things settle down you'll spend more time with her. She loves you guys so much." Christine's response, "She's really nice. I like her. Tell Mom I said hi." Richard, "Will do, sweetheart. Your mom might not remember everything right now, so just be patient with her, okay? It's the medication." Margaret listened to every message. She thought about Daniel at 16, the age she'd been when she first learned that adults could lie to you with a steady voice and kind eyes. She thought about Christine at 14, texting her last night, "Mom, when are you coming home?" Her children had not betrayed her. They had been handed a version of their mother, confused, unreliable, medicated into incoherence. And they had accepted it because they were teenagers and their father was the adult in the room, and teenagers trust adults with kind voices. Richard had not turned her children against her. He had simply begun the process. Quietly, methodically, the way you prepare the ground before you plant something. She was going to make sure nothing grew there. "Send me everything," she said to Whitmore. "Every message, every record, every purchase. I want it all in the folder by tonight. It'll be there by 6. She thanked him, hung up. She sat for exactly 4 minutes, not moving, looking at the sealed window and the warm world beyond it. Then she picked up her phone and called Veronica. "Attempted murder," Veronica said, when Margaret finished. Not a question. A categorization. The flat, precise voice of a woman assembling a legal architecture. "The supplement interference is documented," Margaret said. "Whitmore has the purchase records. The text message is planning it. My oncologist has already noted that my treatment isn't responding as expected. She has records going back 4 months. I'm calling a toxicologist today," Veronica said. "We need a sworn statement before we go to the police." A pause. "This changes the filing. We're not just looking at divorce and fraud. We're looking at criminal charges. Conspiracy. Attempted murder." "Good," Margaret said. A brief silence. "Margaret." Veronica's voice shifted, just slightly. "Are you safe right now?" "In that hotel. I'm 6 floors above them," Margaret said. "They don't know I'm here. I fly home tomorrow morning." "And the children?" "Paula has them. They think I'm visiting a sick friend." She paused. "They're fine. They don't know any of this. I need to keep it that way until I'm ready." "How long?" Margaret looked at the window. The Spanish moss. The warm amber afternoon. 3 weeks, she said. "I need 3 weeks." She made her first invisible move at 4 p.m. Patricia Wu, forensic accountant, recommended by Veronica, 5 feet tall and professionally offended by financial fraud, had been on retainer since that morning. Margaret called her from the desk in room 618 and walked her through everything she'd found. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she said, "The $32,000 gap in the joint savings. I want to know where it went. Can you find it?" "I find everything," said without arrogance. "Simply as fact." "Then find it." She also authorized Patricia to begin the process of separating Margaret's financial identity from Richard's, quietly, legally, document by document. New accounts. Redirected direct deposits. The $23,000 she'd already moved was the first brick. Patricia called it building the perimeter. Margaret called it making sure he gets nothing. Both were accurate. She flew home the following morning. Charlotte was gray and cool after Savannah. She took a cab to the Myers Park house and stood at her own front door for a moment before putting in the key. The hydrangeas along the front walk were still blooming. Purple blue, stubborn, later in the season than they should have been. She put her key in the lock. Darlene opened the door before she could. Maggie, arms around her immediately. Warm, tight. She smelled like the smoothies, citrus, and something underneath, something Margaret now knew the name of, and underneath that the faint lavender of her hand lotion. Margaret hugged her back, held on for exactly the right amount of time. "I missed you," she said, into Darlene's shoulder. "I missed you too." Darlene pulled back and scanned her face with what looked exactly like love. "You look tired. Come inside. I'll make your smoothie." "That would be wonderful," Margaret said. "Thank you." She stepped inside her house. In the kitchen, she could hear Darlene humming. Something half-remembered, a melody from their childhood. Their mother's hymn. "His eye is on the sparrow," the one she always reached for when she needed steadying. Margaret set her bag down, touched the back of her left hand once, briefly. Then she smiled at nothing in particular and went to find her husband. Richard was in the study. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. His face arranged itself into the expression she now understood as a performance. Warm, concerned, the devoted husband. He stood, came to her, put his arms around her. Over his shoulder, she could see his jacket hanging on the chair, the cufflinks catching the light. She pressed her face into his shoulder and said nothing. She was counting. Paula, her best friend, the woman whose call had started all of this, texted that evening. "Just checking on you. Here if you need me." Margaret typed back, "I'm okay. More soon. Thank you for calling me." She meant every word of it. 3 weeks of performance. That was what Margaret gave them. 3 weeks of dying wife gratitude, of letting Richard hold her hand during television programs, of accepting Darlene's smoothies and disposing of them quietly, of saying "I'm so lucky to have you both" in a voice she'd taught herself to make sound true. She was a librarian. She understood character work. She also understood, in those 3 weeks, something she hadn't expected to learn: how lonely it was to know the truth in a house full of people performing love. She had always thought the worst thing was being lied to. She was discovering it was worse to see the lie happening and say nothing, to smile at the person killing you and mean none of it. She was becoming someone she'd never been before. She wasn't sure yet whether that was good or terrible. Probably both. The confusion started small. A Tuesday morning, 9 days after she'd returned from Savannah. Margaret came downstairs in her robe, stood in the kitchen doorway, and looked at Darlene with an expression she'd practiced in the bathroom mirror the night before, slightly unfocused, slightly lost. "I thought today was Thursday," she said. Darlene looked up from the blender. Something moved across her face, quick, involuntary, gone before it fully formed. Not concern, relief. "It's Tuesday, honey." Darlene's voice was warm. "Careful. You've been tired." "It's okay. I've been having such strange dreams," Margaret said. She pressed 2 fingers to her temple. "My thoughts get." She trailed off. "Let the silence do the work." "Come sit down," Darlene said. "I'll finish your smoothie." "Thank you." Margaret sat at the kitchen table. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Darlene smiled at her. Margaret smiled back. Every morning, the smoothie. Darlene made them with the devotion of someone who believed in what she was doing. She lined up the supplements beside the blender. Colloidal silver, grapefruit seed extract, St. John's wort, all purchased in bulk. all hidden in plain sight on the kitchen counter, labeled with the language of wellness. The smoothies were thick and green and smelled like citrus, and something Margaret now knew was the grapefruit extract, sharp and medicinal underneath the sweetness. Margaret accepted the glass every morning with both hands. She thanked Darlene every morning with the same words. And every morning, she carried the glass upstairs, poured it into the bathroom sink, and watched the thick green liquid spiral slowly down the drain. She watched it go with the specific attention of someone disposing of evidence. The color of it, the way it moved, thick and deliberate, coating the white porcelain before the water cleared it. The physical remains of someone's careful murder flushed away while Darlene hummed hymns in the kitchen below, gone. Every morning, swirling down the drain. Within 2 weeks, her blood work began shifting. Dr. Patel called on a Wednesday afternoon. "Your numbers are better," she said. "Significantly. The treatment appears to be working more effectively than our last reading suggested. I've been cutting out some supplements that weren't agreeing with me," Margaret said. "That may be it," Dr. Patel said. "Keep doing whatever you're doing." "I intend to," Margaret said. She'd spent 10 years building a home. They'd spent 14 months building her coffin inside it. She recorded them on a Friday evening. Audio. Her phone in her cardigan pocket, screen dark, recording app running, while she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea and performed confusion and fatigue. Richard and Darlene thought she'd gone upstairs to rest. She sat with them for 40 minutes. She heard Richard tell Darlene, in the careful low voice of a man who believed the woman across the table was too medicated to track conversation. Patricia from work asked how Maggie was doing. "I told her the treatment wasn't working as well as we'd hoped." She heard Darlene say, "She seemed more confused today. Did you notice? At dinner she asked me twice what day it was." She heard Richard say, "Good." One word. The same word he'd used in the text message. She kept her hands wrapped around her mug, kept her expression soft and distant. Let the recording run. When she went upstairs 40 minutes later, she transferred the audio file to her encrypted cloud folder and sent a copy to Veronica with a single line, "Audio from this evening. Add to file." Veronica responded in 6 minutes. "This is extraordinary. We're ready when you are." Margaret typed back, "3 more days. Here is something I need to say directly." What Margaret did in those 3 weeks, the performance, the patience, the complete containment of her own grief while she built the case, is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever written about a real woman. If you have ever had to smile at someone hurting you because the time wasn't right yet, subscribe. Share this. Because the woman in this story is not unique. She just refused to be silent. The climax is 3 parts away. You cannot leave now. The morning before she was ready, she made her own smoothie. She stood at the kitchen counter while Darlene was in the shower and Richard was at the gym, and she took every supplement bottle from the counter, one by one, and photographed each label. Then she put them back exactly as she'd found them, in the same order, the same spacing. She made herself a smoothie with spinach and banana and nothing else. She drank it at the kitchen table in the quiet house. It tasted like something she hadn't had in months. It tasted like her own life. She washed her glass, dried it, put it away. She looked around the kitchen, the limestone counters, the breakfast nook, the window where she'd watched the hydrangeas bloom. Monday, she decided. Monday morning. Everything ready. Everyone in position. She touched the back of her left hand. 3 more days. The estate plans arrived in Whitmore's final report on a Saturday morning. Margaret read them at the kitchen table while Darlene made breakfast in the next room and Richard slept upstairs. She had her coffee, her own, made before Darlene came down, and Whitmore's report open on her laptop. Darlene had been busy. The file contained screenshots from Darlene's personal email. 3 months of correspondence with an interior designer named Frost, based in Charlotte. The first email was dated 6 weeks after Margaret's diagnosis that I'm looking to do a full renovation of a 4-bedroom colonial in Myers Park. My partner and I are planning to move in within the next 18 to 24 months. Budget is flexible. We're thinking $400,000 to start. I'd love to discuss the master suite first. The current owner has particular taste that we'd want to completely redo. The current owner, Margaret was 35 years old, and she was sitting in her own kitchen reading an email in which her sister described her as the current owner. Past tense in intent, if not yet in grammar. She scrolled down. Darlene and the designer had exchanged 22 emails. They had discussed the master suite. Completely gutted, knew everything. In the kitchen, the limestone counters are dated, were thinking marble. In the garden, where Darlene had noted that the current plantings are a bit much, very fussy, we'd simplify significantly. The hydrangeas. Darlene wanted to remove the hydrangeas. Margaret had planted those hydrangeas the spring after her mother died. She had pressed each one into the ground herself, on a gray April morning, as a specific and private act of continuation. Darlene wanted to simplify significantly. The final email in the chain was from 2 weeks ago. Darlene, timeline might be moving faster than expected. I'll confirm the start date within the next few months. Keep the quote ready, Frost. Of course. We'll be ready when you are. Margaret closed the laptop. She was 35. She had 2 children. A 16-year-old boy who had texted his father "Okay, Dad" when told his mother was losing her mind, and a 14-year-old girl who had texted "She's really nice" about the woman poisoning her mother's smoothies. Her children were not villains. They were teenagers who had been handed a false story by the adult they trusted most. But they were still in that story, and she needed to know how deep they were before Monday. She called Daniel at 2 p.m., told him she was thinking about updating her will, leaving everything directly to him and Christine, removing Richard. Daniel said, "Mom, that's really not fair to Dad. He's been taking care of everything. You should leave him at least half." He was 16. He was repeating what he'd been told. She could hear Richard in every word. She called Christine at 3 p.m. Same conversation. Christine said, "Are you sure you're thinking clearly, Mom?" Dad said the medication sometimes makes things confusing. She was 14. She had a 14-year-old's trust in a parent who had weaponized it. Margaret sat with both responses for a long time. She had been hoping her children would surprise her. That one of them would say, "Tell me more, Mom," or "What's going on?" or even just "Are you okay?" with the weight of someone who actually wanted to know. Neither of them did. She grieved them that afternoon. Not because they had betrayed her. They were children. They were being managed. They were not responsible for what Richard had built inside them. But because she had protected them so carefully from every hard thing, and they had still ended up inside this one without her knowing. That did not make it hurt less. It simply made it survivable. Patricia Wu called at 4 p.m. "The $32,000 gap," she said. "Found it. Small transfers over 14 months. He moved it into an account in Darlene's name. $2,000 here, $3,000 there. Nothing that would flag. But Patricia Wu flags everything. Document it," Margaret said. "Already done. One more thing." Patricia's voice shifted, the voice of someone delivering the last piece. "The $500,000 insurance policy. The one he took out on you 2 weeks after your diagnosis. Richard as sole beneficiary." Margaret was quiet. "He forged your signature," Patricia said. "He forged my signature," Margaret confirmed. "That's not fraud," Patricia said. "That's a separate criminal charge entirely." "Added to the file," Margaret said. "The Last Supper was Sunday evening. Margaret made it herself. Roast chicken. The recipe she'd made every Sunday for 10 years. The one both children had grown up requesting on birthdays and holidays. The one Richard had called the best thing you make with genuine feeling, back when his genuine feelings had been directed at her. She set the table, lit the candles, poured wine, called them both to dinner. They came. Richard in his weekend clothes, easy and unsuspecting. Darlene in the blue dress Margaret had always liked on her, her hair down, her lavender lotion smell drifting across the table, her fork hand steady. Margaret looked at them across the candlelit table. She looked at Richard's hands, the hands that had held her face in the oncologist's parking lot and signed a fraudulent insurance policy in her name 2 weeks later. She looked at Darlene's hands, the hands that had pressed smoothie glasses into her palms every morning with something that looked exactly like love. She looked at the candles burning between them. She thought about the interior designer named Frost and the 22 emails about gutting the master suite and removing the hydrangeas. She thought about the text that said "Keep going." She thought about Christine's voice saying Dad said the medication sometimes makes things confusing. She lifted her wine glass. I want to say something, she said. They both looked at her. Richard's expression arranging itself into attentive husbandly concern. Darlene's face open and warm. I am so grateful, Margaret said. For both of you. For everything you've done. For being here. For making this time feel like it's surrounded by love. She looked at them steadily. I mean that, she said. More than you know. Richard reached across the table and covered her hand with his. We love you, Maggie, he said. His cufflinks caught the candlelight that Darlene's eyes were bright. We love you so much, Darlene said. Margaret smiled at them both. She picked up her fork. She ate her last Sunday dinner in this house with the two people who had tried to murder her, and she tasted every bite, and she felt nothing she couldn't use, and she did not look away from either of their faces for the rest of the meal. She washed the dishes after, dried them, put them away. The house was quiet. Richard had gone to bed. Darlene was watching television. Margaret stood at the kitchen window and looked at the hydrangeas in the dark, still there. Purple-blue. Stubborn. Monday, she said to no one. She turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. She slept better than she had in 8 months. For anyone sitting in their own Sunday dinner right now, smiling at someone across the table while your heart does something you can't name. I see you. I made this story for you. If Margaret's patience, her precision, her refusal to break before she was ready, if any of that is doing something real to you tonight, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to perform love for someone who didn't deserve it? I read every single one. She was up at 4 a.m., not because she'd set an alarm, because her body understood, in the specific way bodies understand things before minds catch up, that this was the morning everything changed. She lay in the dark for exactly 4 minutes, Richard breathing steadily beside her, cedar aftershave faint on the pillow between them, the house silent around its own destruction. And then she got up. She dressed in the dark. Quietly. The clothes she'd laid out the night before. Her good coat, the one slightly too big now from the weight the chemo had taken, her best shoes, the pearl earrings her mother had left her. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. She looked like a woman with somewhere important to be. She touched the back of her left hand. Then she picked up the bag she'd packed 3 days ago. Not the anniversary bag. Not the Tory Burch with its cream leather and gold hardware and 10 years of misplaced belief. She'd left that on the bedroom chair deliberately, a prop in the set she was leaving behind. And she walked downstairs without making a sound. She made coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking at the hydrangeas in the pre-dawn dark. Still there, purple-blue shapes in the blackness. Stubborn and completely unaware that someone had been planning their removal. At 5:30 a.m., she picked up her keys. She did not leave a note. The Charlotte Police Department at 6:45 a.m. smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent lights. The specific institutional smell of a building that never fully sleeps and never fully wakes. The overhead lighting was flat and merciless, throwing everything into the particular relief of a place where softness is not the point. Margaret had come early deliberately. She wanted to be first. She wanted her paperwork in hand, her folder open, her evidence organized in the precise order Veronica had specified before the building filled with the noise and motion of an ordinary Monday. She sat in a plastic chair beside a detective's desk and looked at the fluorescent light above her and thought about her kitchen. The warm lamplight over the table, the hydrangeas visible through the window, the smell of her own coffee, made the way she liked it. She was never going back to that kitchen. She had known this since Sunday evening, standing at the window after the Last Supper, looking at the hydrangeas in the dark. The house was a stage set. She had played her final scene in it. Whatever came next would be built somewhere else, on ground that belonged only to her. The detective's name was Soares. She arrived at 7:50 a.m., set down her coffee, looked at Margaret's folder, and said, "How long have you been here?" "An hour," Margaret said. Soares sat down, opened the folder, began reading. At 8 a.m. exactly, Margaret's phone showed Veronica filing. A single text from Veronica's paralegal, filed. 8:02 a.m. Asset freezes active. She turned her phone face down on the detective's desk and continued answering Soars's questions at 9 a.m. A package arrived at Atlantic Building Supplies corporate headquarters on South Tryon Street. Margaret was not there to see it. She was still at the precinct, working through the evidence file with Soars and a colleague named Briggs who read the supplement interaction texts without expression and then read them again. Her phone was face down. Her location was unknown to everyone except Veronica and Paula. She had planned it this way. The package was addressed to Barbara Hancock, CEO, marked confidential. Personal attention requested. Inside, 47 pages. The affair, documented. The fraud, documented. The supplement poisoning, documented with Dr. Patel's medical records and the toxicologist's sworn statement. The $500,000 fraudulent insurance policy with Richard's signature on Margaret's line. The death wish texts. The keep going. The renovation emails in which Darlene described Margaret as the current owner. Barbara Hancock had been profiled 2 years ago in a business journal. Margaret had read the profile 4 times. She knew the quote by heart. In my company, your personal conduct is your professional conduct. There is no wall between them. She had built her package around that sentence. Richard called at 9:32 a.m. Margaret watched his name appear on her phone screen. Watched it ring. Watched it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:34, then 9:35, then a text. Maggie, where are you? Call me. Then, something's happened at work. I need to talk to you. Call me right now. Then, at 9:47, a text that was just her name, Maggie. She turned her phone face down again. Detective Soars, who had been watching this, said nothing. She simply turned to the next page of the evidence file and continued reading. Margaret had once read that silence, in the right context, was the loudest possible response. Richard was somewhere right now. His office, or the parking garage, or the lobby of Atlantic Building Supply. Calling her name into a phone, she wasn't answering. And the silence coming back at him was the first real consequence he had ever faced for anything he'd done to her. She hoped it was very loud. The safety deposit box had been opened by Whitmore on Friday afternoon, with a court order Veronica had obtained Thursday morning. Margaret had read the contents in her car, parked outside the library, engine off. Inside, a second copy of the fraudulent $500,000 insurance policy. A handwritten note. Richard's handwriting, listing account numbers, transfer instructions, and a single line at the bottom. After probate clears, 90 days max. A photograph of Margaret, taken without her knowledge, in the oncologist's waiting room. She was 35 in the photograph, and she looked younger than that, the way sick people sometimes do, smaller, more uncertain, the body already beginning to negotiate with itself, and a prepaid debit card with a balance of $34,000, but she sat in her car looking at the photograph for a long time. He had photographed her in the oncologist's waiting room. She did not know when. She did not know why. For documentation, perhaps, for proof of illness, for some legal mechanism she hadn't yet identified. It didn't matter why. What mattered was the photograph itself. Margaret at 35, in a plastic waiting room chair, thinner than she used to be, her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. Taken by someone who loved her. Used by someone who was waiting for her to die. She had put it in the evidence folder at 9:58 a.m. Carla Washington's story went live. Margaret was still at the precinct when Briggs's phone buzzed on the desk between them. He looked at it. Looked at Margaret. Charlotte Observer just published, he said. Margaret nodded. I know, she said. Keep going. Forgiveness is a door. She wasn't closing it. She was taking it off the hinges and walking through the wall. Richard's final text arrived at 10:14 a.m. I know you know. Please, let me explain. She read it once. She put her phone in her bag. She looked at Detective Soars across the desk, under the fluorescent lights, in the burnt coffee smell of a Monday morning at the Charlotte Police Department, and she felt, for the first time in 8 months, completely and entirely herself. What happens next? She asked. Soars closed the folder. Looked at her steadily. Now, she said, we go get them. You've stayed through all of it. The performance. The patience. The silence that was louder than screaming. If this story is doing something real to you, subscribe. And share this with one person tonight. Just one. Because somewhere right now someone is in their own Monday morning, trying to find the courage to begin. You could be the reason they find this story. The climax is next. You cannot leave now. She was back at the Myers Park house by 11 a.m. Soares had suggested she stay at the precinct until the arrests were confirmed, and Margaret had agreed. And then at 10:47 she had looked at Soares and said, "I need to be there." Soares had looked at her for a moment, the measuring look of someone assessing structural integrity, and then nodded once. "Stay back from the door," Soares said. "Let us go in first." "I know," Margaret said. "I just need to see it." Darlene was in the dining room when the officers arrived. Margaret saw this through the front window before anyone knew she was there, stood on her own front path between her own hydrangeas, and looked through the glass at her sister, who had spread fabric swatches and paint samples across the dining room table. Margaret had refinished herself 3 years ago. Frost's logo was visible on a large envelope propped against the centerpiece. Darlene was on the phone, one hand moving over the swatches with the proprietary ease of a woman decorating her own home, her voice carrying faintly through the glass. Something about the master suite timeline, and yes, I think we can move faster now. Margaret stood on the path and looked at her sister's hands moving across the fabric samples. She thought about those same hands pressing smoothie glasses into her palms every morning. She thought about keep going. She thought about the current owner. Then the officers knocked and Darlene's face turned toward the door, and Margaret watched the exact moment her sister's world ended. The confusion first, then the dawning, then the specific collapse of someone whose timeline has just been permanently rearranged. Darlene looked toward the kitchen window, the place she'd always found Margaret. Margaret stepped into view on the front path. Their eyes met through the glass. Darlene's mouth opened. "Maggie." Margaret couldn't hear it through the glass, but she knew the shape of her own name in her sister's mouth. The officers moved between them. Margaret watched them put the handcuffs on Darlene's wrists. Watched the fabric swatches scatter as Darlene's hands were drawn behind her back. The pale linen samples, the paint chips and shades Darlene had chosen for rooms she had never owned, drifting to the floor of a house that had never been hers and never would be. Darlene was still saying her name when they walked her out the door. Margaret said nothing. She stepped aside on the front path to let them pass. Then she walked inside and looked at the table. She gathered the swatches into a neat pile, put them in the recycling bin under the kitchen counter. Then she put the kettle on. Richard had been escorted from Atlantic Building Supply at 9:45 a.m. At 10:30, he had attempted to access the joint accounts from his phone. Frozen. He had called his attorney. The attorney had quoted a retainer. Richard had attempted to access his 401k to cover it. Frozen. He had called Darlene's phone. Darlene had already been arrested. He had driven to the Myers Park house and found a police cruiser in the driveway and an officer at the door and Margaret's car in the garage. Patricia Wu had built the perimeter with the thoroughness of someone who found gaps professionally offensive. There were no gaps. They thought dying made her weak. They forgot. The ones with nothing left to lose are the most dangerous people in any room. The bail hearing was Tuesday morning. Both denied. Flight risk, the DA argued, citing the evidence of planned asset transfers and a discovered Costa Rica research thread on Richard's laptop. Hotels, property listings, cost of living comparisons, all dated within the last 6 months. Margaret sat in the front row of the gallery in the coat that was slightly too big and watched them both. Richard looked diminished. Not smaller exactly, but revealed. Without the performance, he was simply a 42-year-old man in yesterday's clothes sitting in a courtroom trying to locate the version of events that still worked in his favor. Darlene did not look at Margaret. She sat with her hands in her lap and stared at the middle distance and hummed, very quietly, beneath the noise of the courtroom. Their mother's hymn. Margaret heard it from 3 rows back and felt something she had not expected. Not satisfaction, not relief, but grief. Clean and specific and survivable. She grieved the sister who had hummed that hymn in their mother's kitchen when they were girls. That person had been real. The love had been real. That it just hadn't been enough to stop what came after. The children arrived on Wednesday. Not together. Paula had been with them since Monday morning. She had picked them up from school when Margaret texted her from the precinct, had told them only that their mother needed them at home and their father was dealing with something at work. She had kept them fed and calm and away from their phones as much as a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old could be kept away from their phones in the middle of a national news story. Veronica had sent both children the complete evidence file Tuesday evening, edited for their ages, the core facts, the texts, the medical records. The truth, delivered with care. Daniel came to Margaret first. He stood in the kitchen doorway, looking like a boy who had aged 5 years overnight. He was 16, and he had Richard's jaw and Margaret's eyes, and she loved him with the specific fierce love of a mother watching her child understand something terrible and survive it. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," she said. "He told me you were confused. That the medication, I know what he told you." Daniel's face went young, went back to something that remembered she was its mother. "I should have called you," he said. "When you said weird stuff about changing the will, I should have just asked you what was wrong instead of—" "Yes," Margaret said. Simply, without cruelty. He stood there. "Can I come in?" he asked. She looked at her son for a long moment. Looked at his face, 16 years of a life she had built around loving him. "Yes," she said. "Come in." Christine arrived an hour later, still in her school clothes. Paula having driven her straight from the school where she'd been since the news broke, and someone in her class had shown her the Charlotte Observer article on their phone. She came up the front path, and she was crying before she reached the door, the uncontrolled crying of a 14-year-old who has been holding something for too long and has finally found the right place to put it down. "Mom." Her voice broke on the word. "Mom, I'm so sorry. He made me think you were—" "I know," Margaret said. "I should have known. I should have called you. You're my mom, and I just—" "Christine." Margaret opened her arms. Christine walked into them. They stood on the front path between the hydrangeas for a long time. Christine crying. Margaret not. Her hands steady on her daughter's back, holding on with the specific grip of a woman who has decided what she is keeping and what she is letting go. She was keeping this. The victim impact statement came 3 months later. Margaret stood at the podium and looked at them both directly and did not look away. She said, "You watched me suffer. You held my hand while you were poisoning me. You told me you loved me while you counted the days until my death. You tried to steal the time I have left with my children. You tried to make my children doubt their mother's mind." She paused. "I will not forgive you. Not because I'm incapable of it. Because forgiveness is something you give to people who are sorry, and you are not sorry. You are sorry you were caught. Those are different things." She turned to the judge. "I'm not asking for mercy for them. I'm asking for justice. The kind that makes other people think twice before deciding that a sick woman is easy to take advantage of." Richard received 15 years. Darlene received 12. Margaret watched the bailiff move toward them. Watched the moment the sentences arrived in their bodies. Darlene looked at her once across the courtroom. Margaret held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked away. She picked up her bag. Not the anniversary bag. Not the Tory birch she'd donated to the domestic violence shelter 2 weeks after the arrests. But a different bag, a new one. One that had never been a gift from anyone. She stood up. She walked out of the courtroom into the November light. That if you are still here, if you have sat with Margaret through every part of this, then you already know what this story is really about. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. It's about a 35-year-old woman who was supposed to disappear quietly and didn't subscribe. Not because I'm asking, but because you know someone who needs to find this story tonight. You could be the reason they do. The ending is next. Stay. 1 year later. The Outer Banks cottage in early November smelled like salt and old wood, and the particular alive smell of a place being lived in again. Margaret had opened every window the day she arrived and hadn't closed them since, because she had spent 8 months breathing recycled air in a house that was never really hers, and she was done with sealed windows. She stood at the kitchen counter with her own coffee, her own, the way she made it, nobody else's recipe, and watched the morning arrive over the Atlantic. She was 36 years old. She had her whole life in front of her. Dr. Patel had called 6 weeks ago. Margaret had been on the back porch when the phone rang, her watercolor brushes drying on the railing, a half-finished painting of the shoreline on the table beside her. She answered. Dr. Patel said, I want to be careful about the word I'm about to use. Tell me, Margaret said. Remission. A pause. Full remission. Your last 3 scans are clean. Whatever we were fighting before, the interference from the supplements, the months of compromised treatment, your body has been doing what it was supposed to do all along. It just needed the sabotage removed. Margaret sat down on the porch steps. The Atlantic moved in front of her, enormous and gray and completely indifferent, doing what it had always done. Are you still there? Dr. Patel asked. Yes, Margaret said. I'm still here. She meant it as the most precise truth she'd ever spoken. She had sold the Myers Park house in January. She had walked through every room first, alone, on a Tuesday morning before the realtor arrived, and she had touched the limestone counters and the window above the kitchen sink and the doorframe in the hallway where she'd marked Daniel and Christine's heights every birthday. She had stood in the dining room where Darlene's fabric swatches had covered the table. She had stood in the bedroom where Richard had slept beside her for 10 years. Then she had closed the front door behind her and looked at the hydrangeas one last time. She did not cry. She called the realtor and said, I'm ready. The proceeds, her 50%, protected by the lien Patricia Wu had filed on a Saturday morning, went into an account in her maiden name. Holt. The name she'd been before any of this. The name she'd used in room 618 when she was building the case that saved her life. She kept it. The Tory Burch bag went to the domestic violence shelter on a Wednesday morning in February. Margaret had carried it in herself. The cream leather, the gold hardware, the 10th anniversary gift from a man who had already been planning her death for 8 months when he gave it to her. She had set it on the donation table, and the volunteer had said, Oh, that's beautiful. Someone's going to love this. Good, Margaret said. She walked out without looking back. She drove to a small shop downtown and bought herself a bag that had never been anyone's gift. Dark green canvas, brass clasp. She had carried it every day since. Daniel and Christine spent the summer at the Outer Banks cottage. 2 months. The 3 of them. Margaret teaching Christine watercolor on the back porch while the Atlantic did its enormous thing in front of them. Daniel learning to cook, really cook, not just microwave, in the small kitchen, calling her in to taste things, proud of himself in the way of 17-year-old boys who have recently learned that competence is its own reward. They talked about what happened, not all at once. In pieces, over meals, on walks along the shoreline, in the specific, unhurried way that healing actually moves, not in one conversation, but in 100 small ones, each one adding something back. Her children were not lost. They had been misled by someone they trusted. There is a difference. Margaret had decided to live inside that difference. She volunteers at the county library on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She started a support group that meets on Wednesday evenings. Women who have survived domestic betrayal, financial abuse, the particular violence of being managed and diminished by people who claim to love them. She called it Still Here. She doesn't tell them what to feel. She doesn't tell them to forgive. She tells them what she knows. That survival looks different than you expect it to. That the goal is not to win. The goal is to still be here. Richard still writes from prison. Apologies, explanations, the architecture of a man trying to construct a version of events he can live with. Margaret reads them once, then burns them in her beach bonfire. The fire is actually quite nice in the evenings. Thomas brought coffee this morning without being asked. Sat down beside her on the porch. Said nothing for a long time, which was one of his best qualities. She had decided this was what love was supposed to look like. Not the parking lot. Not the face held in both hands. Not the performance of devotion from someone already planning your replacement. Just this. Someone beside you. Not asking you to be further along than you are. She drove through Savannah on a Thursday in November. Thomas in the passenger seat. She directed him to the Harborview Grand, and they parked across the street, and she looked up at the 4th floor and found the window of room 412. That's where it started, she said. And that's where I decided how it would end. Thomas looked at the window. Were you scared? He asked. She thought about the hallway, the door, the anniversary bag falling silent onto the cream carpet, her phone already in her hand. No, she said. I was a librarian. I knew how to find what was hidden. She looked at room 412 for one more moment. Then she looked away. She was 36 years old. She had her whole life in front of her. She intended to use every day of it. If you stayed until the end, if you sat with Margaret through every part of this, then you already know what this story is really about. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about winning. It's about a woman who was supposed to disappear quietly at 35 and didn't. I want to ask you something before you go. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who loved you? Have you ever had to be patient when every part of you wanted to speak? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right moment, if something in it felt like proof that survival is possible, subscribe. Share it with one person tonight. Not for the numbers. For the woman somewhere right now who needs to know that still here is enough. Drop your city below. I love knowing how far these stories travel. From wherever you are, take care of your heart. Until the next one.